November 19, 1944, a field outside Bougeltraf, France. The ground is frozen. The air smells of diesel and burning metal. Somewhere in the gray morning fog, a Sherman tank sits still, its turret punched open by two direct hits, smoke rising slow and black into a sky the color of ash. Inside that tank is a man named Reuben Rivers. He is 25 years old. He is from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. He is the son of a farmer, a former railroad worker, a man who stood 6'2" and moved through the world like he owned a little more of it than anyone had given him permission to. His leg has been slashed to the bone for 3 days. He had been told to leave by his doctor, by his captain, by every reasonable calculation a human being could make about survival. And 3 times, in 3 different ways, he had said no. The Germans did not know his name. They only knew his tank kept coming. Now it does not. Freeze on that image. Hold it. Because before you can understand what happened in that field on November 19th, you need to go back. Back past the smoke and the frozen mud and the burning Sherman. Back past France entirely. Back to Louisiana, 1942. Back to the beginning of a story that almost never happened, because the people in charge never wanted it to. April 1, 1942, Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The 761st Tank Battalion is activated. On paper, it looks like any other armored unit in the United States Army. It has officers and enlisted men. It has tanks, M5 Stuart light tanks at first, boxy and fast, built for speed rather than survival. It has a chain of command, a training schedule, a budget. What it also has, every single one of its enlisted men is black. This is 1942 in America. Segregation is not a controversy. It is the law. And the law says that black men and white men do not serve in the same units, do not eat in the same mess halls, do not share the same latrines, do not fight side by side, because the assumption, written into policy, whispered in headquarters, printed between the lines of official Army doctrine, is that black men cannot fight at all. Not in the way that matters. Not in the front lines. Not in armor. Camp Claiborne sits in the middle of central Louisiana, deep in the kind of South where that assumption is not just believed, it is enforced. The men of the 761st train in a world that treats them as soldiers during the day and as second-class citizens the moment they step off the base. Restaurants that will not serve them. Buses they are not allowed to sit in. A country they are preparing to die for that has not yet decided to treat them as fully human. They know all of this. They train anyway. In January 1943, a white officer named Paul Bates takes command of the 761st. He is 34 years old. He grew up in California. He went to college on a football scholarship, played hard enough to earn a spot in the Reserve Officers Training Corps, graduated in 1931, and spent the years before the war coaching high school football and teaching class. He is not a crusader. He is not a man who gives speeches about equality or marches for justice. He is something quieter and in some ways more dangerous to the system he operates within. He is a man who simply cannot look at his soldiers and see anything other than soldiers. Paul Bates believes the 761st can fight, not because he has to believe it, because he watches them every single day, and the evidence is irrefutable. He drives them harder than any unit at Camp Claiborne. He runs drills until men drop. He demands precision in maintenance, accuracy in gunnery, speed in tactical decision-making. When higher-ranking officers suggest that perhaps the standards for this particular battalion do not need to be quite so rigorous, that perhaps these men do not need to be held to quite the same bar as everyone else, Bates ignores them. He has a simple philosophy. If his men are going to be sent into combat, they are going to be the best prepared soldiers in the United States Army. And if they are not going to be sent into combat, if the Army intends to keep them stateside, which is what Bates is beginning to suspect, then he is going to make them so undeniably excellent that denying them becomes impossible. He is right to suspect it. Here is the first truth this story demands you understand. The 761st Tank Battalion was not created to fight. Not really. The unit existed because the United States Army needed black Americans to support the war effort, their labor, their tax dollars, their willingness to serve, without actually having to integrate the combat units that white America might object to. It was a political calculation dressed up in military uniforms, a gesture, a symbol. The plan, as far as anyone in a position of real authority was concerned, was to keep the 761st training indefinitely, to let them become proficient in a controlled environment, to hold them up as evidence that the Army was giving black soldiers a chance, and then, quietly, without announcement, to never actually commit them to battle. They were meant to be impressive on paper and invisible in practice. Paul Bates spent 2 years making sure that plan became impossible to execute. He pushed, he lobbied, he refused a promotion to full colonel that would have separated him from the battalion because he understood that the moment he left, the quiet machinery of institutional indifference would grind his men back into obscurity. He stayed, and in June 1944, 3 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, the 761st received orders for overseas deployment. It had taken 2 years. 2 years while the war raged across North Africa and Sicily and the beaches of France. 2 years while other men fought and died and came home to parades. 2 years. But they were going. Before they shipped out, one more thing happened at Fort Hood, Texas. His name was Jack Robinson, 25 years old, Georgia-born, a man of extraordinary physical gifts, a college athlete who had lettered in 4 sports at UCLA, a man whose speed and precision and competitive fury seemed to belong to some larger story still waiting to be written. In July 1944, Robinson boarded a military bus at Fort Hood. A white bus driver ordered him to move to the back. Robinson was a commissioned officer in the United States Army. He had legal protections that theoretically applied to him. He refused to move. He was arrested. The charges landed on Paul Bates's desk. Insubordination, conduct unbecoming. The paperwork was clear about what was expected. Sign the court-martial order. Make this go away. Bates read the charges. He looked at what Robinson had actually done, sat in a seat on a bus, refused to be humiliated, demanded to be treated as the officer he was. Bates refused to sign. His commanding officer did not share his restraint. Robinson was transferred to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was more cooperative. The court-martial proceeded. Robinson stood trial, defended himself with the same stubborn precision he brought to everything, and was acquitted of all charges. But acquittal did not mean return. By October 1944, the same month the 761st was landing in France, Jack Robinson was placed on inactive duty. He would never see combat. He would never rejoin the Black Panthers. He would go on to do something else entirely, something that 3 years later would change American life in ways no one in that courtroom could have imagined. But on that bus in Texas, on that ordinary summer day, he was just a man who refused to move, and the Army made him pay for it. October 10, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. 4 months after the blood of D-Day soaked into that sand, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion came ashore. The battle here was long over. The beach was a staging ground now, a place of logistics and movement, of trucks and cargo, and the organized machinery of a war pushing eastward. 712 men, 36 officers, 6 white, 30 black, 676 enlisted men, every one of them black. They carried with them 2 years of preparation and the particular kind of determination that grows in people who have been told over and over that they are not quite enough. They were assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton had asked for them. This requires a moment of clarification because Patton is a complicated man, and this story does not benefit from simplifying him. When the Third Army ran short of tank battalions in the fall of 1944, Patton sent a request to the War Department. He needed armored units. He needed them now. The response informed him that the only available tank battalion was the 761st, which is to say, it was black. Patton's reply, by most accounts, was characteristically blunt. "Who the hell asked for color? I asked for tankers." This is true. And it is also true that Patton privately harbored the same doubts about black soldiers in combat that most white officers of his era carried, doubts born not from evidence, but from the assumptions of a culture that had never given black men the chance to disprove them. He had written things in private correspondence that did not match the pragmatic openness of that remark about tankers. He was a man who contained contradiction. Most men do. What matters, what this story turns on, is what he did, not only what he believed. Late October 1944, somewhere near Nancy, France, the 761st is moving toward the front. A white first lieutenant walks past a black lieutenant of the 761st. He does not salute. In the United States Army, this is not a small thing. A salute is not courtesy. It is not politeness. It is the foundational expression of military order, an acknowledgement of rank, of structure, of the chain of command that holds an army together in the chaos of war. You salute because the rank demands it, not the person. The rank. The white lieutenant does not salute. General Patton sees it. He does not raise his voice. He does not make a scene. He walks to the white lieutenant with the measured deliberateness of a man who has commanded armies and understands that power does not need to announce itself. He tells the lieutenant to render the proper salute. The lieutenant complies. Then Patton turns to face the black officer. He brings his hand to his own brim. Straight, correct, held. He salutes first. Not another word. October 28, 1944. General Patton arrives at the 761st staging area in a jeep, two ivory-handled pistols at his hips, the theater of command arranged around him like a costume he has worn so long it fits like skin. He stands before the men of the 761st Tank Battalion and he speaks. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my Army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." The men cheer, and somewhere in the formation, Reuben Rivers stands and listens. He is 25 years old. He has been a soldier for 2 years. He has heard powerful men say inspiring things before, and he has watched what happened when the speeches ended and the decisions began. His face does not betray what he is thinking, but he is thinking something. He is thinking that words are what they are, and that what matters, the only thing that has ever mattered on the bus in Texas, in the training fields of Louisiana, in every year of his life, in a country that measured men by their color before their character, is what you do when the moment actually comes. He will find out soon enough what he does. They all will. The front is 3 miles away. The war is waiting. And the 761st Tank Battalion, the unit built to be invisible, trained to be exceptional, denied every assumption that was supposed to define them, is finally going to find out what they are made of. Not on a training field, not on paper, in fire, November 7, 1944. Before dawn, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion do not sleep. Not really. They sit in their tanks and beside their tanks in the cold dark of northeastern France, and they wait for the light to come. Some of them pray. Some of them are quiet in the way that men get quiet when they understand that the next few hours will divide their lives into 2 parts, everything before and everything after. The town ahead of them is called Morville-les-Vic. It is a small place, a cluster of stone buildings on a road that runs through low hills and bare fields. In peacetime, it would be unremarkable. In November 1944, it is held by German infantry, dug into every doorway, every cellar, every window that faces the road coming in. The 761st has been given the assignment of taking it. 2 years of training, 2 years of waiting, 2 years of being told in policy and in practice, in 100 small humiliations, and one large institutional lie, that they were not ready for this moment. The moment has arrived anyway. Paul Bates should be leading them in. He is not. The night before the 761st first battle, on the last dark hours before everything they had worked for was finally put to the test. A German reconnaissance patrol crept through the tree line and found the position where Bates stood on the hood of his Jeep, watching the distant flicker of artillery. A burst of submachine gun fire. Bullets tore into the Jeep. One of them found Bates. He went down hard. The man who had spent 2 years building the 761st into something the Army could not ignore, who had refused promotion to stay with his soldiers, who had put his career on the line for a bus driver's accusation against Jack Robinson, that man was being carried to a field hospital before the first tank of his battalion had fired a single shot in anger. Major Charles Wingo assumed command. Wingo was not Bates. The men knew it. The officers knew it. In the chaos of the hours that followed, the absence of Paul Bates was felt like a missing piece of the ground beneath their feet. But there was no time to grieve the absence. The light was coming. Company B goes in first. Sergeant Roy King commands the lead tank. They push into Morville-les-Vic down a road that narrows between stone walls, the kind of road designed centuries ago for horses and carts, now carrying 60 tons of American steel into a town full of men who want to stop it. They get inside the town, and then a German soldier steps from a doorway with a Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon, cheap and disposable and devastatingly effective at close range, and he puts it into Roy King's tank. The explosion is immediate, violent. 2 men in King's crew go down wounded. King himself climbs out of the burning tank. Not to run, not to find cover. He sees a white infantryman from the 26th Division pinned down in the street, wounded and unable to move. King goes to him, pulls him, gets him clear. In the process, King takes a round himself. He is badly hurt. The medics find him and tell him he needs to get out. He tells them no. He will fight as long as he can walk. He will be dead in 12 days. But right now, in this moment, Roy King is still standing, and the 761st is still moving. Reuben Rivers is in Company A. His tank is at the head of a different approach into the town, pushing down a narrow road through fields that have been stripped bare by autumn. The ground is soft from recent rain, and the tank tracks churn it into mud that sprays up against the hull in dark sheets. Then the column stops. Across the road ahead, a tree felled deliberately, its branches spread wide across both lanes. Woven into those branches are German mines. And from the tree line on both sides, rifle and mortar fire is already coming in. Not enough to stop a tank, but more than enough to kill the infantrymen walking alongside, who are now dropping into the roadside ditches with nowhere to go. The situation is simple and terrible. The column cannot go around. The column cannot go through. Every second it sits still, men in those ditches are dying. Protocol says you stop, you radio back, you wait for orders and for engineers and for the proper procedure to unfold in its proper time. Reuben Rivers does not stop. He opens the hatch of his Sherman and climbs out into the open, into the fire, into a road where German rifles are trying to find him, where mortar rounds are dropping close enough to throw dirt against his legs. He moves to the tree with a cable from his tank, works fast, wraps it, attaches it, gets back in, puts the Sherman in gear and pulls. The tree comes off the road. The mines come with it, dragged sideways into the ditch. The column moves. The town falls before nightfall. For his actions on that road, Reuben Rivers will receive the Silver Star, the first awarded to any member of the 761st Tank Battalion. But that is later, in the paperwork, in the official record. Right now, on that road, Rivers does not think about medals. He thinks about the men in the ditches. He thinks about moving forward. He is always thinking about moving forward. November 10, 1944. 3 days after Morville-les-Vic, the 761st is still in the fight. The Germans have not broken. They are giving ground slowly, stubbornly, from one village to the next, using every ditch and stone wall and tree line as a new defensive position. The terrain is working against the Americans. This part of France is a patchwork of small fields and hedgerows and sunken roads, exactly the kind of ground that slows armor and turns every advance into a grinding negotiation between fire and movement. Sergeant Warren Creasy's tank is moving through open ground when the German anti-tank gun finds it. The first round hits the track. The second hits the hull. The tank stops. The engine dies. Smoke begins to fill the interior, and the crew gets us out fast because a burning tank is not a refuge. It is a crematorium. Creasy gets out with them. He looks around. He sees the situation his company is in. German fire from a fortified position. His unit pinned. Men unable to advance or retreat without crossing ground that is being systematically covered. He sees a half-track nearby with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on it. No one is operating it. Creasy walks to the half-track. He does not run. Walking is deliberate, unhurried, the movement of a man who has decided that fear is a thing that happens to other people. He gets behind the gun. He brings it to bear on the German position, and he fires. What follows is not elegant. It is not cinematic in the way that word is usually meant. It is loud and brutal, and it goes on for a long time. Creasy behind that gun, working through the German position systematically, suppressing one emplacement and moving to the next until the fire that had been pinning his company dies down enough for them to move. He does not stop until the threat is neutralized. The men of the 761st after this day have a name for Warren Creasy. They call him the baddest man in the battalion. It is not said lightly. November 16, 1944, the town of Gubbling. The 761st has been in continuous combat for 9 days. They have taken casualties. They have lost tanks. They have buried men whose names they knew and written letters that no one wants to write and gotten up every morning and done it again because the war does not stop for grief and the mission does not wait for morning. Reuben Rivers is in the lead tank of Company A. They are crossing a railroad track on the outskirts of Gubbling when it happens. The mine is buried beneath the ties. It detonates directly under the tank. A pressure blast that lifts the front of the Sherman and slams it back down, that rattles every man inside like dice in a cup, that fills the air with smoke and the sharp copper smell of explosive. Rivers's leg takes the worst of it. Not a clean wound, not a graze. The metal and force of the blast opened his leg from knee to upper thigh, slashing it to the bone in a wound that the medics who reach him cannot fully treat in the field. They can clean it, they can dress it, they can give him morphine for the pain. He refuses the morphine. He says he needs to think clearly. They tell him he must be evacuated, that this wound in these conditions in this cold will become infected. That infection in the field without proper treatment becomes gangrene. That gangrene, untreated, becomes death. He already knows this. He tells them to bandage it and get out of his way. He finds another tank. He climbs in. The next morning, November 17th, Company A enters Gubbling. Reuben Rivers is in the lead. There is something you need to understand about what Reuben Rivers did in those days, not to make him a saint, not to make him larger than life, but because the truth of it is more important than any mythologizing. He was not unafraid. He was not beyond pain. His leg was a ruin, and he knew it. The infection was already beginning, and part of him must have understood with the clarity that serious injury brings exactly what was happening inside his body and where it was heading. He made a choice, not a dramatic choice, not a choice announced to anyone or offered up for approval, a quiet choice made in the particular silence that exists between a man and his own limits. He chose to stay because the men around him were his responsibility. Not in the abstract way that officers talk about responsibility in training exercises and after-action reports. In the immediate, irreducible way that soldiers understand these specific men in these specific tanks on this specific road today. If he left, the column lost its best tank commander at the moment they needed him most. He stayed, November 18, 1944, Captain David Williams finds Rivers still in the field. Williams is the commanding officer of Company A. He is a black officer in an army that does not give black officers much room to move, and he has carried the weight of that in every decision he has made since the 761st crossed into France. He has watched his men fight with a ferocity and precision that should have silenced every doubt anyone ever had about them. He has also watched Reuben Rivers refuse evacuation for 2 days. He finds him at his tank. The leg is visibly worse. Swollen, the kind of swelling that tells a man with any medical knowledge what is happening beneath the skin. Williams orders him out. Rivers looks at his captain with something that is not quite defiance and not quite pleading. It is something in between, the expression of a man who is asking to be understood rather than overruled. Captain, you know better than that. Tomorrow is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference. The medic with Williams kneels to look at the leg. He straightens up fast. He's got gangrene. Williams opens his mouth to say something, to say Reuben, just the name, the way you say a man's name when you are out of arguments and down to the last appeal, and then the German artillery finds them and everyone goes flat, and when it is over and Williams looks up, Rivers is already moving back to his tank. They do not speak again. November 19, 1944. Morning comes cold and gray over Bugel Company A's tanks move out. Reuben Rivers' tank is in the lead because that is where it always is. The Germans are waiting for them. They have had time to prepare heavy anti-tank guns positioned in the low ground beyond the town, angled to cover the approach, zeroed in on the road that the American armor has to use. The first rounds come in before the Shermans clear the outskirts. 2 tanks go down immediately. Captain Williams gets on the radio. He gives the order to pull back. The column is exposed. The math of the situation is clear, and the conclusion is unavoidable. All units withdraw now. The tanks begin to move back, all of them except one. Reuben Rivers has found the German anti-tank position. He can see where the fire is coming from, and he understands, with the tactical instinct that had made him the best tank commander in Company A, the same instinct that had put him out of his hatch and onto that road at Morville-les-Vicq, that if the withdrawing tanks move without someone covering them, the German guns will find them one by one. He stays. His tank and one other hold position. They return fire. They draw the German guns toward themselves and away from the company, pulling back. They give the others time to get clear. 2 high explosive shells hit Rivers' tank in rapid succession. The first cracks the hull. The second tears through the turret. Reuben Rivers is killed instantly. He is 25 years old. He has been fighting in France for 43 days. He has refused evacuation for 3 days on a leg that was killing him from the inside because the men around him were more important than his own survival. His last act is to cover the retreat of the people he is responsible for. November 20, 1944. Captain David Williams sits down and writes a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. He describes what Rivers did on November 8th at Morville-les-Vicq. What he did on the 16th when the mine went off and he refused morphine and climbed back into a different tank. What he did on the 17th when he led the company into Gebling on a leg that should have had him in a hospital. What he did on the 18th when he told his captain that another 2 days would not make a difference. What he did on the 19th when he held position alone so the others could get out. The recommendation is detailed. It is specific. It meets every criterion. It is filed, and then it disappears into the machinery of a military bureaucracy that has, from the very beginning, found ways to not quite see what the men of the 761st are doing. No one explains why. No explanation is offered. The recommendation sits in a file. The file sits in an archive. The archive sits in a building in Washington, D.C., where it will remain untouched for the next 49 years. December 1944, Hitler moves. On December 16th, German forces punched through the weakest section of the Allied line in the Ardennes forest. a surprise offensive on a scale that American commanders did not believe possible. The assault drives deep into Belgium and Luxembourg, creating a bulge in the Allied front that gives the battle its name. 187,000 German troops, 600 tanks, moving through fog and frozen forest in the last major offensive gamble of the Third Reich. The 101st Airborne Division is surrounded at Bastogne, cut off, holding on. Patton turns his entire army north in 72 hours. Military historians still argue about whether any commander in history has ever moved a force that large, that fast, in conditions that brutal. 3 corps, hundreds of thousands of men, pivoting 90 degrees in winter conditions across roads that barely qualify as roads, in cold that freezes engine oil and turns mud into concrete and makes every mechanical thing reluctant to move. The 761st moves with them, through the snow, through the ice, through nights so cold that the men inside the tanks cannot feel their hands on the controls. They push north toward Bastogne with the rest of the Third Army because the 101st is surrounded and Patton has promised to get to them. And Patton does not break his promises. But here is something that is almost never in the books, something that happened during the Battle of the Bulge that most histories skip over entirely. The Germans, in the opening days of their offensive, deployed a small number of English-speaking soldiers in American uniforms. They drove American jeeps and wore American insignia and moved through American lines, causing confusion, changing road signs, spreading misinformation, disrupting the communications that armies run on. Patton needed to secure his rear areas. He needed men at the checkpoints who could not be easily impersonated. He ordered black soldiers to guard them. The logic was straightforward. A German infiltrator wearing an American uniform could pass for a white soldier in a dark night on a frozen road. He could not pass for a black one. And Patton issued the accompanying order with the same blunt clarity that defined everything he did. Any white soldier approaching a checkpoint who behaved suspiciously was to be detained by force if necessary. It was the first time in the history of the United States Army that black soldiers had been formally authorized by direct order from a senior commander to detain and, if necessary, use lethal force against white soldiers. No one announced it. No one put it in a press release. It simply happened in the cold and the dark and the chaos of December 1944 because the tactical situation demanded it, and Patton was a man who let tactical situations dictate his decisions. The men of the 761st did not celebrate this. They just did the job, like they always did. January 17, 1945, Paul Bates comes back. He has been in hospitals and recovery for 10 weeks since that burst of submachine gun fire in the dark the night before his battalion's first battle. 10 weeks while his men fought through France without him. 10 weeks of lying in a bed knowing what was happening and not being there for any of it. He walks back into the 761st and he looks at what remains. More than 30% of the men he led into France are gone. Killed, wounded, replaced by new soldiers who have the training but not the shared history, not the 2 years at Camp Claiborne and Fort Hood, not the knowledge of what it took to make the 761st what it is. He looks at what is left and he resumes command. The battalion he comes back to is harder than the one he left, quieter in some ways. The men who have survived 40-plus days of continuous combat carry it in the way they move and the way they speak and the way they look at open ground before they cross it. They have seen things that change a person at some fundamental level, below language, below explanation. Bates sees all of this. He says nothing about it. You do not say things about it. You acknowledge it with your presence and you move forward. March 1945, the Siegfried Line. This is the last great wall between the Allied armies and the German interior, a belt of concrete bunkers and steel obstacles and interlocking fields of fire that the Germans have spent years building and that they intend to hold until the war ends or the world ends, whichever comes first. The 761st is given the task of leading the breakthrough. Task Force Rhine, the 761st at the point. What follows is not a single battle, but a sustained act of industrial-scale violence conducted day after day across terrain designed to kill American armor. Bunker by bunker, gun by gun, pillbox by pillbox. When it is over, the 761st has destroyed 31 fortified positions, 49 machine gun emplacements, 29 anti-tank guns, 4 airfields, 7 towns captured, 833 Germans killed, 3,210 taken prisoner, 5 American tanks lost. The door into Germany is open. Patton's armies pour through it, and somewhere in the flow of those months, in the mud of France and the snow of Belgium and the rubble of the Siegfried Line, something else is happening. Something quieter than battle, harder to see. The 761st is being erased, not deliberately, not as a conspiracy, but in the way that history always erases the things it finds inconvenient, through omission, through silence, through the simple act of not writing things down when the things are inconvenient. Major General Willard Paul of the 26th Infantry Division puts it in an internal communication. He writes that the 761st entered combat with such conspicuous courage and success as to warrant special commendation, that their speed in adapting to frontline conditions, their gallantry against some of Germany's finest troops, their spirit, all of it earns them distinction. It stays internal. No press release, no photographs for the newspapers back home, no names in the headlines that American families read over breakfast. Other units, white units, with records that do not match what the 761st is doing in those frozen fields, get the coverage, get the recognition, get the parades that are already being planned for their eventual return. The 761st gets the missions, the hardest ones, the ones at the spearhead, the ones where the first tanks into a town are the tanks most likely not to come out. They take them because that is what soldiers do, because that is what the 761st has always done. Come out fighting. May 2, 1945, Gunskirchen, Austria. The 761st, supporting the 71st Infantry Division, reaches the gates of a place that barely has a name, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp complex, hidden in a forest surrounded by wire, full of more than 15,000 Hungarian Jewish prisoners who have been there long enough to have forgotten what it feels like to not be dying. The gates open. The prisoners come out. A 17-year-old girl named Sonia Schreiber-Weitz walks through those gates and looks up and sees, for the first time in her life, a black American soldier. In the particular madness of that moment, starving, barely alive, standing at the edge of a world she had not been certain she would survive long enough to see. She looks at this man and she feels something that she will spend the rest of her life trying to put into words. She will eventually write a poem about it. A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah. She lives. She carries that moment with her for decades, and she speaks of it and writes of it in terms of reverence that do not diminish with time. The soldier who stood at that gate, the man whose face she saw in the moment of her liberation, his name is not recorded anywhere. He gave her back her life. History did not give him back his name. May 5, 1945. Steyr, Austria, the Enns River. On one bank, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, battered, depleted, changed in ways they do not yet have the distance to fully understand. They have traveled from the beaches of Normandy to the edge of Central Europe through 6 countries, through 183 consecutive days of combat that have taken from them everything that war takes and left them standing anyway. On the other bank, soldiers of the Red Army, they call to each other across the water. They have come from opposite ends of the earth and opposite ends of the war, and they have met here in this Austrian city at this river because the force they were moving against has finally run out of room. The war in Europe is, for all practical purposes, over. No American photographer is there to record the moment when the men of the 761st reach across the Enns River and touch the hands of their Soviet counterparts. No journalist writes the story that night. The victory is real. The silence around it is also real. Both things are true at the same time. And the men of the 761st, who have always understood better than most that two true things can exist simultaneously even when they contradict each other, pack their gear and wait for whatever comes next. They have earned the right to rest. They will not, it turns out, earn much else. Not yet. Not for a very long time. They came home to nothing. Not nothing in the dramatic sense, not an empty dock or a dark city. There were people around. There were streets and buildings and the ordinary sounds of American life continuing in the way it always continues, indifferent to the men returning to it. But there were no parades for the 761st, no ticker tape, no crowds pressed 10 deep along the sidewalks, no mayors at podiums, and no keys to any city. No photographers waiting at the gangplank with cameras ready, looking for the image that would go on the front page and into the history books. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion came home the way they had been sent out, quietly, without ceremony, folded back into a country that had used them completely and intended to acknowledge them minimally. Some of them stepped off buses in uniform. In the South, some of those buses would not stop for them. In the North, some of those neighborhoods would not have them. The country that had asked them to go to the other side of the world and kill its enemies had not resolved, in their absence, the question of whether they were fully citizens of it. The war had not changed that. The war had not changed very much at all. Sergeant Johnny Stevens of the 761st put on his uniform to travel home from Fort Benning, Georgia, to New Jersey. He had survived 183 days of combat. He had driven a Sherman tank through 6 countries. He had been at the spearhead of operations that military historians would eventually describe as among the most effective armored actions of the entire European campaign. He walked to the bus station. The driver looked at him and told him he could not board. Not in that seat, not in this bus, not without moving to the back, which was where the rules said men who looked like Sergeant Johnny Stevens were supposed to sit. He was still wearing the uniform of the United States Army. He had worn it through France and Belgium and Germany and Austria. It did not matter. This was America. And in America in 1945, the uniform was not enough. It had never been enough. The men of the 761st had always known this, had known it when they trained at Camp Claiborne and when they rode segregated buses at Fort Hood and when they watched Jack Robinson get transferred out of the battalion for the crime of refusing to accept his own diminishment. They had gone to war knowing it. They came home to find it unchanged. In the months and years that followed, the men of the 761st scattered across the country and tried to resume the lives the war had interrupted. Some of them went back to the farms and the railroad jobs and the factory floors they had left. Some of them went to college on the GI Bill and built careers in law and medicine and education. Some of them carried what they had seen in ways that did not have names yet, what a later generation would eventually call trauma, that internal weather that changes the climate of a person permanently. They did not talk much about what they had done, not because they were ashamed, not because the memory was too painful, though it was, but because no one asked. The country was busy celebrating its victory, and the victory belonged in the newspapers, in the newsreels, in the stories that Americans told themselves about who had won the war and why, to a version of the Army that did not prominently feature the 761st Tank Battalion. The citations they had earned sat in files. The recommendation that Captain David Williams had written for Reuben Rivers on November 20, 1944, the day after Rivers died covering the retreat of his company, sat in an archive in Washington. Nobody touched it. Nobody explained why. The explanation did not need to be spoken. It was structural. It was institutional. It was the same force that had kept the 761st training for 2 years when other units were sent to fight. The same force that had transferred Jack Robinson rather than discipline the bus driver. The same force that had kept the commendations of Major General Paul internal and out of the press. It was not a conspiracy. It was something more durable than a conspiracy. It was a habit. Paul Bates came home too. He stayed in the Army after the war, made colonel eventually, served at the Command and General Staff College and at the Pentagon. Retired in 1963, settled in Dunedin, Florida with his wife Taffy, a woman he had met back at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in those early years when the 761st was still learning what it was. He was the kind of man who did not stop. In his retirement, Bates did what he had always done with the 761st. He pushed. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He showed up at meetings and congressional offices and veterans organizations with the same stubborn, systematic patience that had built a tank battalion out of men that the Army did not want to use. He was pushing for one thing, recognition, not for himself. Bates had his medals, his Silver Star, his 2 Bronze Stars, his Purple Heart. He had the record. He had the history. What he did not have was an acknowledgement from the country that had sent the 761st to war that what those men had done deserved to be remembered. 33 years he pushed, 33 years. President Jimmy Carter signs the Presidential Unit Citation for the 761st Tank Battalion. The citation reads, in part, for extraordinary heroism in action during the period October 31, 1944 to January 24, 1945. The courageous and professional actions of the members of the Black Panther Battalion, coupled with their indomitable fighting spirit and devotion to duty, reflect great credit on the 761st Tank Battalion, the United States Army, and this nation. Paul Bates is 70 years old when this happens. He stands in the ceremony and receives what he has spent a third of his life pursuing. And if you look at photographs from that day, you can see it on his face. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, but something quieter. The expression of a man who has finished carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He has 17 years left to live. Reuben Rivers' recommendation for the Medal of Honor is still in the archive, still untouched. The veterans of the 761st grow old together. They hold reunions. They tell each other the stories that the history books are not telling. They talk about Roy King and what he did at Morville-les-Vic. They talk about Warren Creasy behind that, 50 caliber. They talk about Reuben Rivers, always about Reuben Rivers, in the way that soldiers talk about the men they have lost, which is to say they talk about him as if he is still present, as if the years between his death and their telling have not created the distance that time usually creates. They are old men remembering a young man. He is always 25. His leg is always just bandaged. His tank is always just moving. He is always just refusing, in that quiet and absolute way he had, to accept any verdict about what he could or could not do. The families of those who did not come back grow old too. Reuben's sister, Grace Woodfork, siblings of the others. They carry the weight of an absence that was never publicly acknowledged, a sacrifice that was never officially honored, a story that the country seemed to have decided was not quite worth the full telling. They carry it anyway, because that is what the families of soldiers always do. Something shifts. Congress authorizes a study. They want to know formally, officially, with the weight of institutional inquiry behind the question whether African American soldiers who served in World War II had been denied the Medal of Honor because of their race. The contract goes to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. The researchers go into the archives. They find what anyone paying attention might have suspected. The disparity is not subtle. It is not a matter of interpretation or of different standards being applied in good faith. The evidence shows that black soldiers who performed acts of valor equivalent to those recognized by the Medal of Honor in white soldiers were systematically passed over. Their recommendations were downgraded. Their citations were reduced. The process that was supposed to be meritocratic had been operating from the beginning with a thumb on the scale. Of the 433 Medals of Honor awarded for service in World War II, not one had gone to a Black American. Not one. More than 1 million Black Americans had served. Not one. The Shaw University researchers identify 10 cases that warrant serious reconsideration. 7 of them, upon full review, clearly meet the criteria for the Medal of Honor. 7 men whose valor had been documented, recommended, filed, and then quietly set aside. One of them is Reuben Rivers. The recommendation that Captain David Williams wrote on November 20, 1944, the day after Rivers died on that field outside Boogeltroff, the day after he held position alone so that Company A could get clear, the day after he was killed doing what he had been doing for 43 days, which was putting the mission and the men before himself. That recommendation had been sitting in an archive for 49 years. It had always said the right things. It had always described a man who deserved the honor. The country had simply not been ready to give it. In October 1996, Congress passes legislation allowing President Clinton to award the Medals of Honor to the 7 men identified by the Shaw University study. The statutory time limit for such awards had expired long ago, and an act of Congress is required to set it aside. An act of Congress, that is what it takes in 1996 to correct what happened in 1944. January 13, 1997. The White House. It is a cold day in Washington, the kind of cold that settles into old bones and does not leave quickly. The East Room is full. Family members, surviving veterans, dignitaries, historians, the accumulated weight of a story that has been waiting 53 years for this room and this moment. President Bill Clinton stands at the podium. He speaks carefully. He speaks directly. He says what needs to be said without flinching from what it means. No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it at the time. He says it plainly, not as an abstraction, not as a historical observation at arm's length, as a fact about a specific identifiable failure of the country he leads. A failure with names attached to it. A failure that lasted half a century. 7 medals are presented. 6 of them are presented to family members because 6 of the 7 men who earned them are dead. Vernon Baker, the only living recipient, stands and receives his medal himself. He is 77 years old. He has been waiting for this moment since 1945. He receives it with the kind of dignity that makes the waiting visible, not bitterness, not performance, just the quiet bearing of a man who knew all along what he had done. Grace Woodfork steps forward. She is Reuben Rivers' sister. She is old now. The decades between 1944 and 1997 written in her face and her hands and the way she holds herself with the particular gravity of someone who has been carrying something precious for a very long time. The President of the United States places the Medal of Honor in her hands. She holds it. There are no words adequate to this moment. There are no words adequate to the gap between what her brother did and when the country chose to say so. 53 years is not a rounding error. It is not an oversight or a bureaucratic delay. It is a choice made and remade across 5 decades to let the record remain incomplete. Grace Woodfork holds the medal her brother earned on November 19, 1944. She holds it the way you hold something that should have come to you a long time ago. She does not need to say anything. Her presence says everything Paul Bates does not see this day. He died on February 21, 1995, in Dunedin, Florida, 2 years before the ceremony he had spent decades working toward. He was 86 years old. He died knowing that the Presidential Unit citation had been secured, that the record was at least partially corrected, that the 761st had received something of what it deserved. He did not live to see the medals. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors in Section 60 among soldiers, which is exactly what he was. Step back now. Step back from the White House ceremony and from Grace Woodfork's hands and from the cold January light coming through the East Room windows. Step back all the way to October 1944, to that moment near Nancy, France, when a white lieutenant walked past a black officer of the 761st and did not salute. George Patton saw it. He intervened. He made the lieutenant correct himself. He rendered the salute himself, standing straight in the road, hand to his brim, looking the black officer in the eye. It took perhaps 30 seconds. Now hold that moment next to January 13, 1997. 53 years, 2 months, and 15 days separate them. A gesture of basic military courtesy on one side, a presidential ceremony correcting a half-century of institutional failure on the other. Both of them say something true about the country that contains them. The salute says that one man in one moment chose to enforce the standard that the rules required. It was right. It mattered. It sent a signal through the 761st that traveled faster than orders. But the 53 years say something too. They say that a gesture, however meaningful, is not the same as a reckoning. That a salute in a road in France does not undo a filing system in Washington that quietly buries the recommendation of a 25-year-old man from Oklahoma who died so that the people behind him could get clear. These are not contradictions. They are the same story, told from different angles. Reuben Rivers is buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery and Memorial in Saint-Avold, France. Section row 5, grave 53. He has been there since 1944, since the weeks after Bugletroff, when someone had to do the work of marking where he lay and giving the location a number and recording it in the ledger of the dead. He is 25 years old in that grave. He will always be 25. The world aged around him for 53 years. The country he served changed and did not change, made progress and retreated from it, moved toward justice and away from it, in the uneven, contradictory, grinding way that countries move, and he stayed 25 in that field in France, under a white cross in a long row of white crosses. His citation, when it finally came, described what he did in the language of official commendation, conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The language is formal. It is correct. It is the language that the Army uses when it honors its dead. But if you want to know who Reuben Rivers was, not the citation, not the medal, not the official record, you need to go back to Captain Williams standing in a field on November 18th, saying just the name, just Reuben, the way you say a man's name when you have run out of arguments and down to the last appeal. And Rivers is already moving back to his tank. That is who he was. Jack Robinson, the man who was pushed out of the 761st for refusing to sit at the back of a bus in Texas, went on to do what the whole world now knows he did. In 1947, he walked onto a baseball field in Brooklyn and changed American life in ways that the courtroom at Fort Hood could not have predicted, and the Army that court-martialed him could not have imagined. He spent the rest of his life refusing, in 100 different ways and contexts, to accept the verdict that the world kept trying to impose on him. He knew something about what that cost. He had watched it cost Reuben Rivers everything. He never forgot the 761st. He spoke of them. He carried them. And in the particular way that history works, the way lives intersect and meanings compound across time, the man who was exiled from the battalion before it went to war became one of the people responsible for making sure the world eventually knew what the battalion had done. The bus ride in Texas, the courtroom, the transfer out, all of it in the long view connected, all of it part of the same story. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 consecutive days. They liberated more than 30 towns. They drove through 6 countries. They broke the Siegfried Line. They helped relieve Bastogne. They reached the Enns River and shook hands with the Soviet Army and stood at the geographic end of a war they had been told before it began that they were not capable of fighting. They received 391 individual decorations for heroism, 11 Silver Stars, 69 Bronze Stars, nearly 300 Purple Hearts, 1 Medal of Honor. 53 years late, the men who earned those decorations came home to a country that made them sit at the back of the bus. They grew old in a country that was slowly, haltingly, unevenly becoming something better than what it had been. They attended reunions and buried each other and told the stories that the history books were not telling, because if they did not tell them, the stories would be lost. Paul Bates fought for them for 33 years from his retirement. David Williams filed a recommendation for Reuben Rivers that took 49 years to act on. Grace Woodfork held a medal that should have come home with her brother. And somewhere in France, in section row 5, grave 53 of the Lorraine American Cemetery, a 25-year-old man from Tecumseh, Oklahoma, is still leading the column, still refusing evacuation, still putting himself between the fire and the people behind him. This is not a story about a salute. It never was. It is a story about what it costs to fight for something that has not yet decided to fight for you, about the particular kind of courage required not just to go into battle, but to go into battle knowing that the recognition and the honor and the basic human acknowledgement of your sacrifice may not come for decades, may not come in your lifetime, may not come at all. The men of the 761st knew this. They went anyway. They came out fighting every single time. That is the story. That is all of it. And if you think the 53 years are only history, if you think the gap between what people deserve and what they receive closed completely somewhere between 1944 and now, then sit with that for a moment. Sit with the image of Captain Williams writing that recommendation on November 20th, the day after. Sit with Grace Woodfork's hands in 1997. Sit with the name that no one recorded, the soldier at the gate of Gunskirchen, the man Sonja Schreiber-Weitz called the Messiah. He gave her back her life. We never gave him back his name.